Okay, so RFID, Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. In 2013, this eating disorder was presented to the literature to describe in more detail individuals with food selectivity. And why is this new diagnosis so important? Well, it helps add more detail to the nature of disordered eating, which is important as no two cases, no two individuals are ever the same. It captures disordered eating across the entire lifespan, so it broadens the age group of people who can be diagnosed and supported with their eating concerns. So in the past, very young children were getting diagnosed with pediatric feeding disorders. When I first started at West Coast, we probably saw a majority of kids between the ages of 2 and, say, 10. But now we have clients 10 to 30, 10 to 32, I think is my oldest that I have now. So now adults or late teens or preteens can be diagnosed with an eating disorder that they may have been struggling with their whole life. It addresses feeding issues even if an individual is not malnourished. So nowadays, if someone gets a diagnosis of malnutrition, it's typically because they can't afford to get the proper nutrients or afford the Pediasure or the Ensure or something that has a lot of calories and nutrients in it. Nowadays, a lot of people are able to do that, so they're not getting the malnourished diagnosis. But that doesn't mean they don't still have a feeding concern. It also takes into account the psychosocial concerns that affect people with disordered eating patterns. So this is referring to the impact a child's eating disorder or disordered eating pattern can have on their quality of life, but also the quality of life of their entire family. In order to be diagnosed with RFID, you must have at least one of the 4 following diagnostic criteria. So significant weight loss, significant nutritional deficiency, a dependence on enteral feeding or oral supplements, and a marked interference with psychosocial functioning. Eating problems can interfere with employment, participation in school and other activities, and the ability to form relationships. Even in younger children, it is evident that feeding problems can interfere with their psychosocial functioning. Parents of children with feeding problems, as Lauren mentioned previously, can often lead to more aversive instructions during mealtimes. They might have more negative comments, especially around food towards their children at meals, than their counterparts of parents of eaters who are healthy eaters. And a child with feeding problems can influence whether or where the family chooses to eat. So a lot of families that we meet are unable to go to restaurants. They might not be able to go to family dinners such as Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter, Hanukkah, because they're unsure of what their child will eat, or they will have to very pre-plan their meal, eat a whole bunch before they go, bring their own food to the meal, which can sometimes cause some disruptions between whoever made the meal in the first place. Maybe you're offending grandparents if you're bringing your own plain pasta to dinner, or they go for food afterwards. This can also drastically impact how far that family can travel away from their home. So a lot of clients that I meet will often stay very local, so they know they can pack an entire suitcase full of foods that their child will eat. But when you start to think of traveling outside of Canada, outside of Vancouver, we have weight limits now on how much weight you can put inside a suitcase. So packing a suitcase full of Kraft Dinner and Pediasure doesn't really seem like a very affordable way to travel. So if you're traveling to, say, China or India, Japan, places where you know your child is probably not going to eat those Western foods, they're not going to find the plain pasta, they might not have the plain rice. It makes it very difficult to travel long distances and overnight. There are 3 exclusions to a diagnosis of RFID. So the disordered eating due to a lack of available food. So if the individual is unable to attain a certain amount of food to get the calories that they need or the nutrients that they need. Individuals with RFID lack the preoccupation with body shape and weight found in individuals with anorexia or bulimia nervosa. And the disordered eating is a result of a current medical condition such as GERD or esophagitis. So if they have any one of those 3 exclusions, then they would not be considered for a diagnosis of RFID. So what does RFID actually look like? There are three main characteristics of RFID, and an individual can have one, two, or all three of these characteristics. The first one is a lack of interest in eating. The second is sensory sensitivities. And the third is a fear of aversive consequences. The first characteristic, a lack of interest in eating. Many theorize that individuals that show no interest in eating are born with a predisposition to a low homeostatic appetite, or they find food less pleasurable or tasty. There's been some research between individuals with RFID and healthy eaters, and the research showed that the appetite decreasing hormone was higher in the RFID participants after an overnight fast than it was compared to the healthy eaters group. When you eat a limited volume of food, which most people who have a lack of interest in food of RFID have, they tend to eat a lot smaller portions. So they often feel really full only after a few bites of food, even though their body isn't receiving an adequate amount of nutrition to sustain them. They often eat at odd times of the day, or they fast throughout the majority of their day because they're trying to avoid eating socially, or they just don't remind themselves to eat. Eating is not a top priority for them. They often have the sensation of feeling really full very quickly and very uncomfortable when they are full. So this starts to create a loop of chronic food restriction. It leads the stomach capacity to decrease, which makes eating larger portions very uncomfortable for them, which then means the next time that they eat, they're going to eat a smaller amount, and so on. It all serves to reinforce a pattern of limited intake. And once that stomach starts to shrink, it can be very difficult and very uncomfortable to eat adequate portions of food. So how does eating very little affect you? As I mentioned, it can reduce your appetite further, making your stomach shrink. It can lead to eating the same food over and over again, foods that you know are safe to eat, and that leads to boredom. It can make you feel depressed, irritable, or hangry, anxious, apathetic, have difficulty concentrating, and can have major social impacts, especially as you start to get to those preteen or teenage years and you start to turn down social invitations to birthday parties, sleepovers, and all of those invitations because you just don't want to eat with the group that you're going with. It can cause nutrient deficiencies, and it can lead to long-term health problems such as diabetes, heart disease, and various cancers. The second characteristic of RFID is sensory sensitivities. Individuals who are sensitive to sensory properties of foods often base their selected foods on color, texture, temperature, or the taste of food. So as Lauren mentioned earlier, this can lead to wanting to eat foods that always taste exactly the same. So thus they're eating more prepackaged foods, those refined carbohydrates, really sugary foods, rather than choosing to go to those fresh raw vegetables and fruits. The blueberry example is a good example. I usually call it the Russian roulette game of blueberries. You never know if you're going to get a sour one and a sweet one. Can be a fun game to practice with the kids. Sometimes bite half the blueberry. You see if it's sweet or sour, make the face, pass it off to them, and see how they respond as well. And then even if they do get a sour taste, they are still playing a game. It makes it a little bit fun. Sensory characteristics of food can be very aversive for individuals with sensory sensitivities. Foods that are really juicy, such as grapes or tomatoes, can be surprising and overwhelming for them to eat. And they might be very rigid about the way foods are presented. So for example, someone might take a bite out of an apple whole, but they won't eat an apple cut up. Maybe it's due to the fact that when you cut up an apple, it starts to brown rather quickly, or it just looks different. They may also eat melted cheese rather than cubed cheese, and melted cheese might just be an easier consistency for them to chew and swallow than a piece of cubed cheese. So some possible reasons for sensory sensitivities. It could partly be genetic. We're born liking certain flavors such as salty and sweet. So super tasters, they're born with a higher concentration of taste buds on their tongue. Linda Bartoshuk from Yale coined this term in the 90s to describe a group of individuals who had a heightened taste, especially towards bitter flavors, which makes eating vegetables quite challenging. So there is a neat experiment you can do if you want to find out what kind of taster you are. So there's 3 different kinds of tasters: non-tasters, average tasters, and super tasters. So you'll take a small drop of blue food dye and put it on the tip of your tongue. Take a drink of water, swish it around, make sure the dye gets all over your tongue, spit it out, and try to make your mouth relatively dry by swallowing a couple times. And then you use one of those old-fashioned hole reinforcer rings, the little stickers with the hole in the middle, and you put it on your tongue. Within that circle, you should find either big pink polyps. Those are your fungiform papillae, and they consist of 3 to 5 taste buds on each single form. So if you find between 0 and 15 within that little circle, you're a non-taster. It means that you don't taste flavors quite as strongly as other people. It's more of a muted taste. If you have between 15 and 30, you're an average taster. You taste food very similarly to everyone else. But if you're a super taster, you have 30 or more fungiform papillae within that little tiny circle. And when you have a disposition to tasting foods much more strongly, it can take many more exposures of a food before your tongue is used to that flavor. So just because you're a super taster does not mean you can't eat different tastes and textures. It just means it's going to take you a longer time to desensitize your mouth to those tastes and textures. Lauren mentioned earlier about neophobia. So this is a reluctance to eat new foods for fear it might make you sick. So this fear has prehistoric ties. 200,000 years ago, our ancestors were hunters and gatherers. They were less likely to choose a berry that they've never seen before, or perhaps hunt a fish they've never seen before, for fear it might be toxic or make them sick. But nowadays in Western society, we have mega grocery stores that deem this a pretty maladaptive trait. Most often when you go to a grocery store, unless you are severely allergic to that food, it is safe to eat everything in the store. And as Lauren mentioned earlier as well, problematic feeding for typical eaters peaks around the age of 2 to 3, but by the age of 5 or 6, children are now accepting foods again that they rejected as toddlers. So many new parents are unaware that initial rejection of a new food reflects a transitory neophobia. It's not long-lasting. It will likely not persist as long as you continue to present those foods to your child. However, that initial refusal can be quite big, and it can also lead new parents to think that their initial dislike of a food is fixed and unchangeable, so rather than presenting that food again, they just avoid it altogether. And many individuals are sensitive to textures, and even the sight of a food can make them gag or shudder. One common one that I see is slimy foods, so bananas, really ripe berries so that you can see the juices flowing off of them, or proteins that are mixed in a sauce, so very saucy or slippery looking textures. So eating the same foods all the time can make new foods taste really different. So if you're eating a very beige, bland, sugary, carbohydrate-rich diet, when you try something like a vegetable, it's going to taste extremely different to your taste buds because it's a big shock to the system. It's not something that it's had before. If we're going to bring some math into it, I won't pretend I'm very good at math, but let's use my diet as an example. I probably have over 200 different foods that are in my diet. So if I add one new food, it's a very small percentage of change to my diet. And it's very likely that that new food that I'm going to try has a very similar property to at least 1 or 2 of the other foods that I'm already currently eating. Color, shape, texture, flavor, it's going to be very similar. But if we look at a child with RFID's diet, they might only have 4 foods in their diet. So if they add a 5th food, that's between a 20-25% change to what they're currently eating. And if you're asking them to eat a vegetable and they're only eating carbohydrates, that's a drastically different sensory change for them. So eating the same foods all the time can lead to boredom and lead you to drop foods from your diet. It can create nutritional deficiencies. And when you actually have a nutritional deficiency, that can also change the way that food tastes, making it more difficult to try. And as I mentioned, it can cause health problems, especially if you're eating foods high in fat and sugar. and not eating whole foods such as fruit and vegetables. You also start to miss out on opportunities to actually try new things, as if you're going to a family dinner, you might miss out on eating that turkey that maybe you haven't tried before because you don't want to eat there. So we're avoiding situations where novel foods might be present. The third aspect of RFID is a fear of negative or aversive consequences that will happen after you eat. So some fears, or the most common fear that we see, is a fear of gagging or vomiting. It's quite common when you have a new taste or texture in your mouth to gag on the food. This also happens with babies when they have new tastes and textures in their mouth. They often gag on the food, and it doesn't really mean that they don't like it. It's just new and the body is reacting to it. But we have had pretty severe consequences happen with kids. So choking incidences that are so severe that afterwards they are so fearful of swallowing that they can't even swallow their own saliva. We've had a couple clients that will just sit there and either spit into a bowl, spit into a cup, spit into a napkin, but they can't even swallow their own saliva. Pain is another one. So I like to give the example of I had a client who was eating chicken nuggets at his aunt's house. Within 30 minutes, his appendix had burst and he was being rushed to the ER for his appendix to be removed. And that was quite painful for him. And the next day, he stopped eating. And when we sat down with him to try and figure out what was going on, at first we thought maybe it was the pain medication or the trip to the hospital. Maybe he was still in pain and just not feeling well. But then, as the days went on, still wasn't eating, quite concerning. So he said that his appendix burst because he ate chicken nuggets. Which was very helpful that he was able to verbalize that for us. And then we were able to teach him, okay, let's go back. Let's try that chicken nugget. Let's see if it happens again. We were able to test his hypothesis. Sure enough, no appendix burst, and it was safe to continue eating chicken nuggets. A lesser common one, but still one that we see, is severe anaphylactic allergies. My one client that I use the most often for this example, he had pretty severe allergies to eggs, nuts, soy, fish, and milk as well. So that's quite a lot of foods that he'd have to avoid. And when he was little, not knowing that he had these allergies, he would often try to eat these foods off of his parents' plate, off of his brother's plate, or just out and about at a friend's house. He would try them, he'd get really sick, and he'd end up having to use his EpiPen. So by the time he was 7 or 8, 9 years old, and he started to exert a lot more control over his diet, he dropped everything except for blueberry muffins from Tim Hortons and bags of plain Lay's potato chips. So when I met him at the age of 14, that's all he was eating. And it made sense. He just didn't want that to happen again. It can take one instance of a negative event to make a conditioned response. This event can be so aversive that person creates an immediate association that food is harmful and it must be avoided. Okay, and when we avoid certain foods, it can lead us to use some safety behaviors to prevent more trauma from happening to your body. So taking really small bites, we have the nibblers that take 7+ minutes or 60 bites to finish a fishy cracker. Chewing for way too long. I have a lot of older clients who over-chew protein. So we'll see them take a bite that's probably the size of a fishy cracker and chew it for 10+ minutes before they can chew or swallow. Sometimes it's still too challenging to swallow, so they end up spitting it out. A lot of clients drink a lot of water in between bites of food, like they're trying to flush the flavor, make sure all the taste and texture of that food is out of their mouth before they take another bite. Some like to swallow food whole just to get it over with, even though the chance of choking or gagging is very high when they try to swallow food whole. And a really common one we see is only eating in certain environments. So individuals only eating at certain restaurants, only at grandma's house, but more often than not, only eating within their home and not eating at school, not eating when they're doing other activities outside of the house or in their community. And some individuals avoid eating anything altogether and just rely on drinks for sustenance, such as Pediasure, Ensure, juice, and pop, and other liquids. The longer this loop of avoidance goes on, the harder it is to test that hypothesis that something bad is going to happen. So I'll take you back to that experience of the boy who had his appendix burst. Luckily, we were able to get those exposures in really quickly, just days after the incident happened, once we realized that's why he stopped eating his food. And we were able to test the theory, chicken nuggets don't equal bad. It's not going to happen again. But if we start to leave that in our head for a really long time, that eating certain foods, fruits and vegetables, for example, is going to be dangerous or scary, and we're going to gag or we're going to vomit, it starts to become an insurmountable goal. It starts with just, avoiding them at the supermarket. Don't walk past them. And then, I'm just not even going to be in a room with them. And then all of a sudden it becomes this massive mountain to overcome where you start to have actual anxiety symptoms when you're presented with those foods.